Okay, thank you for coming. I hope we see Linda Golzer today, because today's her birthday. And I see Diana's wedding with happy birthday. Anyway, we have several birthdays, and I'll pass our prayer request book around. Okay, announcements for today. Let's go through these quickly, and I gotta tell you, I just came from the balcony, and I was videoing Jacob this morning, so I've seen this, but I haven't read through the meetings. Carrie, you did a good job. Where's Carrie?
She'll be back.
She'll be back. She did a good job. She was on the podium this morning. You're going to hear a stewardship information. We're going into the summer, and Rob Banta did a great job. His deal. He said, remember when you look at on Channel 8 News and you see what's his name? Pete Delkus. Yeah, Pete Delkus. He says, ready for the summer doldrums and meat and all that. He says, well, we're ready for the summer giving doldrums. So in Wilshire. So let's get ready for that. Vacation Bible School coming up. There's a whole bunch of stuff on page 11 for women of Wilshire and in your handout. And I think those are the big ones. Are there any other group announcements, church-wide, that we need to cover?
Well, if anybody can come on Wednesday, June 6th, that's when New Song sings their finale for
Okay.
the year, and it's actually an introduction into next year.
Okay.
So
Fantastic.
it'll be in the sanctuary.
Wednesday, June
Wednesday at noon.
at noon. Good. Okay. Anything else we need to recognize? Well, we're going to turn this over to Aaron, and I've got good news for you. So Aaron's wife is going to teach us on July 29th. I'm very excited about that. So we're looking forward to that. And if any of you, and I'm talking to myself right now, ever have any kind of problem knowing the order of the last name, this is a Carr coil, and this is a Coyle-Carr.
I'm gonna steal that. That's perfect. I've never thought about that one. We used to say, we decided to go with Coyle-Carr because Coyle sounded too much like gargoyle. That's a good one too. I'm stealing that one. Oh my goodness. Well, good morning, friends. So today, thankfully, unlike the last time I was with you, we have less than one book of the Bible to talk about, rather than an entire half of the Bible. If you weren't here the last time I was here, we covered the entire Old Testament in 45 minutes. It was
Wonderful.
breaking. That was very gracious. So today, we are only going to be looking at half of the book of Daniel, because the time period and ideas that we are interested in today are what we commonly refer to as the Babylonian exile. Brief sort of historical just snippet. If you remember, after the reign of King Solomon, his son Rehoboam is a really, really bad king, and so a group of his citizens under the leadership of one of his generals rebel against the reign of Rehoboam, and they establish a separate kingdom comprised of the 10 northern tribes of Israel. That kingdom continues to call itself Israel, although because there are now 2 kingdoms comprised of Israelites, it gets really confusing. And so sometimes we refer to often we refer to the northern kingdom as Samaria, because Samaria is where the capital is established in the northern kingdom. Judah and the tribe of Benjamin remain loyal to the house of David, and they continue as a separate kingdom in the south. The capital is still Jerusalem, and they have their. This is a period of incredible political change and upheaval. Lots of bad kings, a couple of good kings, lots of crazy alliances with different other ancient Near Eastern empires, and all of this. And anyway, all of this culminates in the year 722 BC. When the Assyrians, who are a sort of far eastern edge of the Middle Eastern sort of superpower, decide they want to expand all the way to the edge of the Mediterranean, and they come in and they conquer the northern kingdom of Samaria. Judah and Benjamin survive by making an alliance with the Assyrians. They say, we kind of see the writing on the wall. We're going to become what sort of modern scholars refer to as a vassal kingdom. They kind of continue to govern themselves more or less, but they're ultimately kind of under the control of the Assyrian Empire. So they kind of become a state in the sense of, Texas or Oklahoma. They're a sort of administrative subunit within a larger empire that has a degree of autonomy and self-control, but not the ultimate degree of autonomy and self-control. This is a problem for a number of reasons, largely because in this time period, a lot of people interpret God's promise of the land of Israel to mean not just sort of living on the actual tangible dirt of this place, but actually having a sense of national sovereignty and self-rule and self-direction. And so when Judah becomes a sort of member of the Assyrian Empire, it causes all kinds of problems, and they're always kind of trying to get out of it. And one way that they decide they're going to try and get out of it is by actually allying themselves with a new empire that arises about a generation later called the Babylonians. And the Babylonians conquer the Assyrians, take over their empire, sort of fold a lot of that same territory into their own empire. And Judah says, we're with these guys. The Babylonians don't ever really deliver on their promise of allowing Judah to have the level of national sovereignty that it wants. So Judah, more than once, rebels against Babylon, which is kind of dumb, because Babylon is, superpower, and Judah is minuscule in terms of the kind of geopolitics of the 5th and 6th centuries. And it finally gets to the point that Babylon is so tired of these rebellions that Nebuchadnezzar II, who is the king of Babylon in the 580s, decides that he's tired of these meddlesome Israelites. He's going to put them out of their misery forever. So he and his armies come in, they besiege Jerusalem, they eventually take the city, they burn the temple to the ground, they destroy Jerusalem, and they take a large population of the people of Judah into exile in Babylon. Now it's interesting that a number of things begin to happen in this time period. So not everybody is taken into exile, by the way. It's really only the elite of society who get taken away, nobles and princes and priests and people in the religious establishment. A lot of people are actually left behind, and the folks who get left behind, both in Samaria and in Judah, kind of are trying to figure out how to survive at home without any of the same resources that they've had, and they intermarry with a lot of Canaanites and other people, and they sort of eventually become the people that we know in the New Testament as the Samaritans. Not the Sumerians, but the Samaritans. And they actually begin this really interesting project of insisting that there is a way for them to be faithful Jews in this period of exile, and it actually happens when they build a replacement temple in Samaria. So they actually have their own second temple that is separate from what was the temple in Jerusalem, and they begin to kind of create their own very idiosyncratic form of Judaism that sort of happens in temple-centered Judaism that happens while the rest of the people of Israel are in exile in Assyria and then in Babylon. It's not something we talk about very often because there's not a lot of sort of written traditions left behind. They produced a few copies of the Old Testament that are important for the way that we understand how the text of the Old Testament kind of moves through history. But it's this sort of quirky little blank spot in Jewish history. And there are a couple cryptic references in the Old Testament to the people of the land, or similar phrases, and some scholars think that that's a reference to the people who stayed behind in the land while the exiles were off in Babylon. So that gets us to Babylon, which is a really bizarre and fascinating kind of place. And in Babylon, the people of Israel are kind of wrestling with three really big questions. The most important one is, how on earth did we get here? Way back in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, God has given them this pledge. You will be inhabitants of this land forever. This belongs to you. All the way back to Abraham. This is a promise that God has made to the people of Israel. There are, in several places in Deuteronomy especially, kind of clauses that say, if you don't, hold up your end of the bargain, I can take the land away. But there's this sense in which the covenant was supposed to kind of maintain Israel in the land, and now they're not there. And they want to know how it happened. And so one of the books that we're not going to talk about that probably gets produced in this time period, originally produced in this time period, is the book of Chronicles, which in our English Bibles is 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And there's a clear sense when you read Chronicles, especially when you compare it to 1st and 2nd Kings, which was probably written a little bit earlier, that the person or persons who is writing the book of Chronicles is trying to wrestle with Israel's national history and try and find out where things went wrong. The bad kings in the book of Chronicles are even worse than they are in the book of Kings, and even the good kings in the book of Chronicles, even the kings who are good in the book of Kings, kind of get their reputations grayed up a little bit in the book of Chronicles, because one of the answers that people start to develop is that, well, the nation as a whole, which is represented and embodied in the king, sinned against God to such an egregious extent that God decided to enforce those clauses in the covenant with Moses that allowed for God to take the land away from Israel. Some people who are lifted up particularly in this fashion are Ahab, who was the king while Elijah was a prophet in Israel, and Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who was a king a little bit after Ahab. And the sins that they commit in terms of idol worship and refusing to follow God, economic injustice, and a kind of creating of a state that refuses to honor God the way that God intended, is so great that God decides that the only way, it's almost like a kind of Noah option. God decides the only way to fix this is to break it all and then to start again. Because one of the other questions that emerges in the exile is this going to last forever? So once they kind of wrestle with how did we get here, the next question that arises, and you see this particularly in the latter chapters of the book of Isaiah and the book of Jeremiah, is will this last forever? Will we ever get back to the land? And Jeremiah in particular, we'll see in just a minute, has a very clear vision that God is actually going to bring the people back. So even though everything has been broken, the temple has been burned to the ground, kind of all of the things that were supposed to be normal have ended, Jeremiah insists, and remember that Jeremiah eventually goes away into exile with the people, and he insists to them, even as they're living in exile, this isn't going to last forever. And in fact, Jeremiah puts a very specific timetable on it. He says within 70 years, we'll be restored to our homeland, and we'll have the ability to continue God's project with us. So how did we get here? Is this going to last forever? What do we do in the meantime? And this becomes probably the most important question for the period of exile, because what do you do? Almost all of Israelite religious tradition at the point of the exile is centered on temple worship. It's actually been a very sort of explicit practice that several kings have sort of enforced, that smaller kind of local places where you could go and worship Yahweh have been kind of mushed into the temple, and it's all centered in Jerusalem. And there are several sort of religious figures, the person who wrote First and Second Kings, for example, who kind of believe that God sort of is only and specifically present in the Holy of Holies in the temple. And so if God is only in that one place, and we can't get to that place, in fact, we're so far away from that place, we might as well not even know about it, how does this community of Israelites in exile begin to understand itself as the people of God, as a minority population in this massive empire? What does it mean to be Jewish in this point in time? So a number of things begin to happen that are really important. The first one is that the people of Israel start writing scripture down. Up until this point, as best we can sort of understand, most of what we now call scripture, or the Old Testament, that was written that existed prior to the exile, was oral. It was in the form of stories, or brief, the book of Psalms, for example, brief songs that could be easily memorized and recited. And in fact, it seems that there are even sort of competing traditions that may have been, Abram and Abraham get sort of very nicely mushed together in the final version of the book of Genesis. But there's some evidence to suggest that they actually may have been two different people, that there may have been a sort of tradition of Abram stories and a tradition of Abraham stories, and that in the sort of final editing they get dovetailed together because the themes are very similar, the themes of faithfulness and covenant and sort of believing God's promises even in the face of having to bear a child at the age of 190, which is a pretty incredible manifestation of God's promises. Anyway, that's beside the point. All of this oral scripture that has been floating around begins to get written down because there's a concern that without the regular pattern of worship in the temple, it might get forgotten. And so people actually start writing it down for the first time. And that means that people who live in different parts of the country or people who have different experiences of God or whose maybe local religious elder has told them one thing, now all of a sudden they're in conversation with people who might have different understandings of what it means to worship God or to what needs to kind of be in Scripture. And so there's evidence, especially in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, of a really kind of concerned and concerted effort to bring all of these Israelite traditions together and try and figure out how they can all work together. The second thing that happens, and this is probably the most important thing in terms of the transition from Israel's conception of itself as the Israelites who exist in one specific place and time and kingdom, to Israel as Jewish people who are Jewish, who long for a specific place but can kind of exist in a variety of different places. And this is the development of the synagogue tradition. So like we've said, prior to exile, everything about Israelite worship is centered at the temple. There are probably local religious gatherings because if you don't live in Jerusalem, you don't go to the temple except for a couple of times a year. But that's where the sort of main focus of Israelite religion is. And again, when you can't get there, what do? Well, in exile, it seems that people began to sort of figure out that there was a way to offer sacrifice to God, that didn't necessarily involve animals, that prayer and praise and gathering for worship on a set day of the week could actually constitute a form of sacrifice. There's a sense in which it's not quite as good as being in the temple offering animal sacrifices, but there's this sense that until we can get back, this will suffice. And so this tradition that if you can get 10 adult Jewish men together, and however many women and children are a part of the community, you can have a synagogue. You can offer prayer services, and that until you can get back to the temple, this becomes a way for you to continue to maintain your unique Jewish identity. And as Jews move back into Israel after exile, and after sort of much later in the 1st century AD, when they're expelled from Israel by the Roman emperor, they take those synagogues with them. And so all over the kind of Roman world of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, you can find communities of Jews who are worshiping in these synagogues, even though, they might literally be in Spain, have never seen the temple, might never have the ability to get to the temple for temple worship, but they have a community of faith that constitutes a unique and a faithful way for them to continue being Jewish. And all of this kind of falls in the larger sort of guiding question that any minority population has to face when it finds itself in navigating a relationship with a majority population, which is to what degree do we assimilate ourselves to this population, and to what degree do we resist and maintain our own unique sense of identity? And where is the line? Because nobody can ever fully assimilate, and nobody is ever fully able to maintain their own sense of culture when they find themselves in a different cultural setting. So what is the balance between these two things? And what's really interesting is that codified even in the Old Testament, you have a number of voices kind of speaking to different sides of that question. So as we're going to see in a little bit, Daniel comes down very firmly on the side of resist assimilation, maintain culture, preserve our distinctives at pretty much any cost. But can somebody read for me, please, Jeremiah chapter 29. Find the right verses
Chapter
29, verses 4 through 7.
Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Till the end of 7.
But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare you will find your welfare.
So Jeremiah doesn't go all the way to completely assimilate yourself into Babylonian culture because, Jeremiah is a prophet of Yahweh. He doesn't want the people to forget their distinct religious identity. But there is a sense, and this is a letter that he writes to the first group of people who are deported to Babylon before he himself gets deported to Babylon. And he tells them, you're going to be there for a while. You're going to need to find ways to work with these people, to live with them, to be concerned for the welfare of the common city that you now share together. And what's interesting is that in Hebrew, the words that he uses for marrying wives and giving, he doesn't specify that these need to be Israelite women. There's a strong possibility that he envisions the people of Israel intermarrying with the Babylonians while they're present, because they're going to be there for what would have constituted basically 2 generations. So Jeremiah kind of falls much further away from Daniel in terms of, well, let's maintain our unique religious identity, but there's a sense in which we can find ways to be a part of this culture, be a part of this people, work with them, and seek the common good of this new place that we now occupy. So that's a sort of big 30,000-foot view of the period of the Babylonian exile. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts? Does that stir up anything in you? Okay, good. That's a good sign. So I mentioned a minute ago that this is the period where a lot of scripture gets to be written down. The tricky bit is that not a lot of scripture gets written down that explicitly deals with the experience of exile. It's always kind of underneath. It's kind of the undercurrents that run through, especially the first 5 books of the Old Testament, but also, like I mentioned in Chronicles, there's this pervading sense in the Old Testament that the writing down of Scripture is a response to the experience of exile and a sort of guard against ever experiencing it again. But there's not a lot of reflection about the actual experience. Some people argue that the Book of Lamentations was written by Jeremiah in response to the siege and destruction of Jerusalem, which you can make that argument. It's not explicit. So really, the only piece of literature in the Old Testament that deals with the actual kind of experience of being in exile, with the exception of a couple of Psalms, I forgot about those, is the book of Daniel. Sort of. So Daniel presents itself. Well, somebody read Daniel 1 through 2.
In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord let King Jehoiakim of Judah fall into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. These he brought to the land of Shinar and placed the vessels in the treasury of his gods.
So the very first thing that the book of Daniel tells us is that everything that's about to take place takes place within the context of the Babylonian exile. There's a community of Jews who are living in Babylon. We're about to meet a particular one of those Israelites. His name is Daniel, or his Babylonian name is Belteshazzar, which is a great name. If any of you have grandkids coming up, I highly recommend Belteshazzar as a possibility. It's a good, strong name. But when we actually...
7 to learn to spell it.
Probably, yeah. It'd be tricky, but, it'd be worth it. But when you actually dig down into the original languages of the book of Daniel, you start to find something really interesting. Chapter 1 is written in Hebrew, but chapter 2 switches to Aramaic, which is a distinct language it's related to Hebrew, but it's different. It's probably the language that Jesus would have spoke, and uses some of the same Hebrew characters, but it's just different enough to be its own distinct language. And in terms of sort of the way that we understand the composition of Hebrew and Aramaic as languages, Aramaic is a little bit older, and the evidence, the vocabulary in, chapter 2 all the way through chapter 7 are written in Aramaic. So there is a chunk of Daniel that is written in Aramaic, and the vocabulary is very old, which suggests that there is a part of Daniel that is old, that may even, in fact, this is questionable, but it may actually be somebody's own reflections on their experience in Babylon. But there is a whole second half of the book of Daniel that is written in a much newer form of Hebrew, and that's chapter 1 and chapters 8 through 12. And I am giving thanks for that this morning, because that means I don't have to talk about chapters 8 through 12, because they're not about the Babylonian exile, and they're complicated as all get out. If you ever want to just tie your brain in knots, read Daniel 8 through 12, and try and tell me what on earth is going on. I think I actually have a pretty good idea of what's going on, and some days I can't even convince myself that I actually know what's going on in those chapters. The short version, which I'll give you for your own edification, is that it seems that Daniel 8 through 12 were written in the 150s BC as a coded way for people the Israelites who are now back in Israel and Judah, but they're under the control of a Greek empire. One of Alexander the Great's generals controls that part of the world, and he's a really terrible human being. He oppresses the Jews. He especially is unkind to them in terms of their religion. And so he sacrifices a pig on the altar in the temple in Jerusalem, which is a big no-no. Pork is anyway. So there's a revolt. This is the story, by the way, of the Maccabees and how Hanukkah comes. It's all tied up together. And so there's this strong consensus among people who know much more about the book of Daniel than I do, that the events of chapters 8 through 12 are coded language that describes what happened in the 150s, right before the Maccabees rebelled and created a new independent Jewish state. It's really complicated, and I like I said, we're not going to go into it because it was written in the 150s. It doesn't actually have anything to do with the experience of the exile. But chapters 2 through 7, and also a little bit of chapter 1, do have a lot to do with the experience of exile. So we're going to wrestle for just a little bit with chapters 2 through 7, which are a collection, by the way, of what we call courtly tales. They take place in the court of various kings, first the king of Babylon, then the king of Persia, which we'll talk about in just a second, and they involve a number of wise Israelites, Daniel and his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which, by the way, I didn't learn this until I got to college, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are the Babylonian names of those 3 young men. Their Hebrew names are somewhere in here: Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And what's really interesting is that after chapter 1, those 3 young men kind of get referred to exclusively by their Babylonian names, but Daniel gets to maintain his Hebrew name. And so there's some question, there again you begin to see some of that tension of assimilation versus identification. Do we keep the names that were given to us by the Babylonians as a way to kind of fit in, or do we maintain our unique Hebrew names, which, especially in the case of Daniel, communicate not just a sense of sort of national and personal identity, but carries an immense amount of theological freight as well. Because in Hebrew, the name Daniel, you might have guessed because it has E-L on the end, it has something to do with God. El is one of the Hebrew names for God, and Dan is related to the verb to judge. And so in Hebrew, Daniel's name means God is my judge, which gives us a clue, as names often do in the Old Testament, as to who Daniel is and what Daniel is going to be about. If God is his judge, and not just any God, but El, the God of the Israelites, he's going to be concerned primarily with how that God is going to judge him, rather than how the Babylonians and the Babylonian gods are going to judge him, which is exactly how Daniel kind of comports himself while he's living in Babylon. So before we actually jump into these stories, because they're really good stories, and some of them are very well known, you could probably give me the plots to most of them, just right off the top of your heads, because they're in, ironically, a lot of them are about like murder and political intrigue and human sacrifice, but they're in our children's Bibles, because they're so beloved. But before we jump into these stories, I do need to, what's that? Oh yeah, that's right, music comes up every once in a while. Yeah, when we did Esther this past year, we left off the part where, you know, the community rises up and kills everybody. So we do some theological editing every once in a while, as is appropriate for our children, but, you know, that's fun. The last thing I kind of want to say before we jump into these texts and experience them a little bit is that outside of the Old Testament itself, there is no historical evidence for the existence of this person that we call Daniel. Which is a really interesting question because the Babylonians and the Persians who came after them were sort of meticulous record keepers. A lot of the information that we have about the ancient world in this time period comes from these massive libraries that we have discovered in sort of Babylon and in Persia. And there's a sort of astounding archaeological record that in a lot of places does match up with what the Bible has to say. So perhaps the most famous example of this is if you've ever been to London and gone to the British Museum, you know that right there in the middle of the sort of ancient Near Eastern exhibits, there's a cylinder that's about this big. It's made out of clay, it's white, and it's got these spiky letters written on it, and it's called the Cyrus cylinder. In the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, there's a description of the Persian king Cyrus the Great, who sends the people of Israel back from Babylon to Israel and actually gives them money and support to rebuild the temple and rebuild the city of Jerusalem. So that's in the Old Testament. Well, in the middle of the 20th century, in Persia, a group of archaeologists discovered an official document that was written on this clay cylinder that said more or less the exact same thing. That, in fact, Cyrus, the historical king of Persia, who, by the way, this is just a freebie. Cyrus the Great was the king, or the sort of Persian emperor, and while he's letting the people of Israel go back to the Promised Land, he's also fighting the Greeks in the Balkans and in that area. So if you've ever seen the movie 300, or you know anything about the battles of Marathon and Thermopylae that are he's doing that too. So it's a sort of fun little confluence of history. I know I often tend to think of the Babylonian exile and the return from exile as being way, way back in the mists of history. It's sort of, for me, it's always this kind of mysterious, I don't know what's going on. But it's actually happening at sort of the beginning of the Greek, as the Greeks are coming out of what they call their own dark ages and are kind of entering into the archaic period of Greek history. So it's this really interesting kind of mashup that is really not that sort of distant, but there aren't a lot of records, and so it makes it feel a little bit more distant. So if, I'm talking a lot, I'm going to let you talk in just a minute, we're going to get to it. But the last point, there's no historical record for Daniel outside of the Bible, which doesn't necessarily mean that Daniel never existed, but there are a couple of references elsewhere in the Bible to a kind of mythic figure of a Daniel that existed way, way, way in the past. Jeremiah is at one point talking about the virtue of patience, and he mentions Noah and Job and Daniel, who up until that point in the Hebrew Bible hasn't been mentioned before. So there are some people who make the argument that Daniel is kind of a mythic figure for wisdom and patience, kind of in the way that our sort of mythological depiction of George Washington or Abraham Lincoln have become kind of stand-ins for the virtue of honesty. Well, Daniel potentially was a stand-in for the virtue of wisdom and patience, and so when people are trying to figure out how to describe the experience of exile, which requires a lot of wisdom and patience, Daniel kind of became the guy that they sort of hung their experiences on and said, well, this is how Daniel would handle the experience of exile, so we should probably do the things that Daniel did. There we go. Now to the actual text itself. So we already read Daniel 1 through 2. I'm trying to think, where's a good place to pick this story up? Here we go. Will somebody read Daniel 8 through 10?
But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the royal rations of food and wine. So he asked the palace master to allow him not to defile himself. Now God allowed Daniel to receive favor and compassion from the palace master. The palace master said to Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king. He has appointed your food and your drink. If he should see you in poorer condition than other young men of your own age, you would endanger my head with the king.
What do you make of that? Do you hear echoes of any other biblical texts, maybe texts not even from the Old Testament, from the New Testament?
We failed already.
No. It's not a failure at all. So this is the beginning of Daniel kind of navigating that assimilation, uniqueness narrative. And one of the things that he's been asked to do by his Babylonian captors is eat the way that they eat. Well, we know from a number of sources, the Apostle Paul being one of them, that often in the non-Jewish world, meat was first offered to pagan idols before it was either used in public feasts or before it was sold to vendors to then sell to the people. So there's a strong possibility that the food that Daniel is being given to eat by the king of Babylon has been first offered in some way to the pagan deities of Babylon. And this for Daniel is a thing that is forbidden. You cannot eat food that, in Judaism, you cannot eat food that has been offered to a false idol or a god who is not Yahweh. So he falls in this question on the point of refusing to assimilate. And he says to the guy who's in charge of bringing the food, I don't want to eat any of the food that the king has offered to idols. We're going to try something different. And if you keep reading, he tells the king, or he tells the palace master, this man who he's found favor with, that he and, I'm going to use their Hebrew names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, are all only going to eat vegetables. And they're so confident in God's care for them that he tells you heard the palace master say that part of the concern for this is that if Daniel doesn't eat the food, he's going to be weaker than all the other young men, and the king doesn't want that to happen. And so Daniel says, well, I'm so confident in the ability of my God to honor these decisions that we're making, that we're only going to eat vegetables. And I bet you, he doesn't actually say this, but I bet you $1 that at the end of this trial period, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and Daniel are all going to actually be stronger than the young men of Babylon who have been eating meat. And so Daniel kind of, not only does he refuse the cultural traditions of Babylon, but he actually says, my traditions are superior, and my God is superior, and we're going to prove it to you. And it works. As you might expect in a story like this, Daniel is wise and he has patience, and so he and the 3 other young men eat only vegetables. I think they eat fruit too. No, vegetables and water. They're the first vegetarians in ancient literature. And for a period of 10 days, there's a kind of a limit to the test. They do it for 10 days. It's almost like a juice cleanse. 10 days, and you laugh, but there's a book called the Daniel Plan. Are any of you familiar with this? People have tried to take this program and turn it into an actual viable diet that you can use to lose weight if you need to. So at the end of 10 days, it was observed, it doesn't say who it was observed by, but this is verse 14 or 15. It was observed that they appeared better, and this is important, fatter than all the young men who had been eating the royal rations. Just another tidbit for your edification. in the ancient world, body fat, is actually seen as a sign of wealth and prosperity, because it means you don't have to spend every waking moment of your life working in the field providing for yourself to be able to eat. So it's only really sort of with the industrial period that the sort of hyper lean body has become kind of the norm. And so the fact that they appear fatter is actually a good thing. It means that this diet is working. And then if you keep reading on to verse 17, to these 4 young men God gave knowledge and skill in every aspect of literature and wisdom, and Daniel also had insight into all visions and dreams. And so their faithfulness to God and to their unique culture is rewarded not just by the fact that their physical bodies appear to be in better condition than the bodies of the Babylonians, but their mental faculties also are better than those of the Babylonians. And this is important because Daniel and the 3 other young men are going to rise very, very high in the administration of the Babylonian Empire, and God gives them the skills to, they basically become sort of provincial governors by the end of it, and they need these skills to actually make it happen. Then we get a bunch more stories that kind of repeat this the same pattern. Chapter 2 is one of my favorites, actually. It's not one of the most well-known of the 6 stories of Daniel and the 3 young men, but it's the most, it's actually really funny, and in kind of it's sort of a dark humor kind of a way. So what happens is that as Daniel and the 3 young Hebrew men kind of continue to be well-known in Babylon, the king kind of hears about them. And as often happens to kings in the ancient Near World, Nebuchadnezzar has a bad dream. And it consumes him. He cannot figure out what this dream means. So he does something really bizarre that just, I can't even, it's so funny. He calls all of his soothsayers and magicians together and he says, I had a bad dream and I need you to interpret it. But in order for me to know that you're interpreting it authentically and you're not, colluding with each other to try and say things that make me feel happy, I'm not going to tell you what the dream was. So you have to divinely intuit the dream itself and then interpret it and then present it to the king in such a way that he doesn't chop your head off. Because if you keep reading, it's not a very happy dream. Not great things are coming for Babylon. And so there's this frenzy in the kingdom, in the capital city. All of these Babylonian priests and soothsayers are running around, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And Daniel and the 3 other Hebrew boys hear about it, and they pray. And God tells them what the dream was. And Daniel goes to Nebuchadnezzar, and he tells him what the dream was, and he interprets the dream, and he finds incredible favor with the king. And he continues this sort of upward rise. The second half of chapter 17 is Daniel's explanation of the dream, and it sounds a lot like the material in chapters 8 through 12. So there's some overlap, but there's also possibly some connection to the exile, because Nebuchadnezzar has this dream of a golden statue that is eventually a rock strikes it on the feet, and the statue goes, am I getting ahead of myself? No, this is right, yeah. A rock falls from heaven, and it strikes the foot of the statue, which is actually made of iron mixed with clay, and the statue collapses. And the interpretation that Daniel gives is essentially, your empire is not going to last forever. Somebody is coming who's going to take your empire away from you. And in fact, this happens about 15 years later when the Persians conquer the Babylonian Empire. We're going to kind of put that with chapters 8 through 12, because a lot of people think that they're probably, the sort of patterns and periodizations sound a lot like 8 through 12, and in fact, if you do a lot of reading on this, there are a billion different interpretations of what. So the statue is actually made out of 4 metals. The head is gold, the chest is silver, the legs are bronze, and the feet are iron mixed with clay, and then there's a stone that comes and destroys the statue. So a lot of people make the argument that this statue kind of represents the periodization of history itself, And so Daniel kind of connects it to various empires that are going on in his day. The gold represents Babylon and the silver is Persia, and then there are two other empires that come along and they all eventually get destroyed. But there are a number of people, chief among them, Mr. C.L. Schofield, who you may know from Left Behind fame, there's a Schofield Bible Church just right down the road. He was the guy who kind of came up with the way that Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins interpreted the book of Revelation to get the idea for Left Behind. And Schofield made the argument that this statue actually represents the kind of empires of major world history. So gold was Rome, because to him, sort of classical Rome was the most important, biggest, best empire that ever existed. And then silver was some of the other empires that and he kind of keeps on going. And then what's interesting is that Schofield, who was himself, I think originally, Schofield was American, but his teacher, Darby, was Scottish. Makes the argument that the bottom of the statue, the iron and clay, is actually the kind of Anglo-American empire in the early 20th century. And that the stone that comes down and destroys the statue is the stone that represents the kingdom of God and the coming of the Messiah and the kind of inbreaking of a very sort of apocalyptic, left behind type of eschatology, which is way more than you ever wanted to know about Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the golden statue. The important part of all of this is that Daniel trusts God to do this impossible thing. God delivers, honors Daniel's trust, and Daniel again continues to advance through the ranks of the Babylonians. The next story that comes up is the story of the fiery furnace, which you all know very well, I'm sure. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are sort of singled out because the narrative kind of makes it seem like Nebuchadnezzar is inspired by this dream. It's a very bad dream, but he decides, hey, a golden statue, that's a good idea. I'm going to build one of myself, even though Daniel has literally told me it's going to fall down. So he builds a golden idol, and he requires everybody in Babylon to worship this. If you have grandkids, you've maybe seen the VeggieTales version where the idol is replaced by a giant chocolate bunny, which is a great interpretation of the story. Daniel, for some reason, is nowhere to be found in this story. He's, I guess, off somewhere else. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get caught refusing to bow down to this statue, and so Nebuchadnezzar throws them into a fiery furnace. A furnace, this is such a fascinating detail. They stoke the fires of the furnace so hot that the men who throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the furnace die because it's so hot. I actually watched a really fascinating documentary once on whether or not that was actually physically possible, and they couldn't quite make it work, but anyway. So the three guys get thrown into the furnace, and the people who are watching, I guess it must have had a big enough door that you could see into it, although I don't know how that would keep the fire hot enough. They're watching, and they see 4 people in the furnace, and of course the 4th one is an angel of the Lord who rescues them, and they come, of course, yeah, sorry. The 4th one is an angel of the Lord who rescues them and brings them, they get pulled out of the furnace, and Nebuchadnezzar has this moment of sort of almost conversion of, the God of Israel is awesome, and he did all these things, and then he promptly forgets about it, like he does, because kings are forgetful. In chapter 4, he has another dream, and Daniel is able to interpret that one, but he also goes crazy. Nebuchadnezzar experiences a bout of some kind of either religious ecstasy that nobody can understand, or a form of mental illness that nobody is able to understand or identify at that point. And so he flees from Babylon and lives in the wilderness, kind of like a wild beast for a number of years. There's actually a really great William Blake painting of this experience that I wish I had a way to show you, but just Google William Blake, Nebuchadnezzar, madness. You should be able to find it if you can spell Nebuchadnezzar. Google will help you. So he experiences this bout of madness, and then something happens, he's able to come back, and Daniel is able to say, this is God's judgment on you, your kingdom is going to be taken away from you. And we don't get any of the narrative in the book of Daniel, but at this point in history, the Persians, who have been kind of emerging from what is now Iran, begin to become kind of a world superpower, and they cement themselves as a superpower by conquering Babylon and sort of taking over their empire, which extends all the way to the Mediterranean. And Cyrus will even try and push it up through Turkey and into Greece, which we've mentioned. So then chapter 5 deals with this transition to Babylon, or to Persia, excuse me. Daniel continues to become sort of favored in the sight of his new Persian kings, all the way up until this bizarre little episode where the king, Belshazzar, is giving a feast. And this probably was really confusing because his name is Belshazzar and Daniel's name is Belteshazzar, so they probably got cross wires all the time. But he gives a feast, and he does this, by the way, with some of the sacred vessels from the temple. Nebuchadnezzar had taken some of the cups and plates and things that were on the altar in the temple, and he brought them back to Babylon. And Belshazzar decides, well, we're going to have a feast, and we're going to use some of those sacred vessels to eat off of and drink off of. And in the middle of the feast, a hand appears, just a hand, and it writes on the wall a phrase in Aramaic, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Uparshin, which Daniel interprets for Belshazzar as you have been tried, weighed, measured, and you have been found wanting, which is a great line that they pick up on in the movie A Knight's Tale, by the way. It's a fun little confluence. Basically, Daniel says that the time of Belshazzar has come to an end and a new king is going to arise. This seems to be his role, as kind of ushering on the transition of the empire. And what's interesting is that Belshazzar doesn't kill Daniel, because usually when you tell a king that their empire is about to end, they kill you. But actually what the text says is that that very night, Belshazzar was killed and Darius the Mede received his kingdom being about 62 years old. So we have another transition of power, this time to a man named Darius the Mede, for whom, by the way, there is also no extra-biblical historical evidence. He's been tried to kind of lined up to a bunch of different historical figures, but nobody can quite make out who he is. So he might be a composite, he might be, we're not entirely sure who this Darius guy is, but Darius is important because Darius is the one who sets in motion the most famous story of Daniel, which involves Daniel and the lion's den. Exactly.
Which one of the kings was the Alexandrian general?
That's much later.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's so that he was the king of kind of Syria and Israel in the 150s BC, when the second half of Daniel was
Okay,
written.
so we haven't got.
We have not gotten to
What was-
Alexander yet.
Do you recall his name?
Yes, his name is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So, Darius. Darius kind of continues this pattern of trusting Daniel, requiring Daniel to be present and relying on him as his governor. But there are a number of other officials in the government who are jealous of the success of this young Jewish man. They don't like the fact that he is different from them. They are jealous of his success, and so they're able to convince Darius somehow that Darius needs to enact this law that makes it illegal to pray to anyone but the king. And Daniel finds out about this, and Daniel says, well, that's not the way it's going to be. So Daniel continues to pray to God, and what's interesting is, let's see, where is it? Oh, here it is in verse 10. Daniel has developed a particular ritual of praying that seems to have been important to the people who are living in exile, in that they didn't just sort of pray wherever they were, but 3 times a day they prayed facing the direction of Jerusalem. So they prayed with a specific sort of geographical orientation towards their homeland. And in fact, a lot of synagogues, later synagogues that exist kind of after the Babylonian period, because they're the ones that we have the best archaeological evidence for, will have the sort of back wall where the Torah is kept, pointing towards Jerusalem. And this is a tradition, by the way, that gets picked up with a variation in Christian churches. In the 4th century, when Christianity becomes first a tolerated and then a legal and then an official religion, when Christians start building massive cathedrals and basilicas, the apse, which is the round part at the back where the altar is, always faces east, because east is where the sun comes up in the west, and east, with the sun coming up, is a symbol of resurrection. So all of the great cathedrals of Europe, All of the ancient cathedrals of the Mediterranean world, they're all built with this kind of east-west orientation, with the idea that when the sun comes up, when resurrection occurs, you sort of experience it almost immediately from that place. So, also, by the way, a tradition that gets picked up on in Islam in the 6th century. When Muslims pray, they pray facing Mecca. So all three of these Abrahamic faiths have this really interesting sense of being oriented towards a specific type of geography. And this is the first time that it appears in the Old Testament, that Daniel prays facing Jerusalem. So somehow, the people who are conspiring against Daniel catch him in the act. And I say somehow because the text makes it clear that most of the time when Daniel prays, he's praying in his bedroom. So these guys are being not just like creating systems of oppression, but they're like sneaking around and trying to catch Daniel in the act. So they sneak into his bedroom, they find him doing it, and like a toddler who has found somebody else breaking the rules, they go running away to the king and saying, Mom, look what Daniel did, you're gonna get him in trouble. And so at first they don't tell Darius what Daniel did, and they bring Daniel, and Daniel tells him that he was praying, and it's kind of this moment where where Darius goes, oh crap. Because they kind of, the other governors convince him to do this, and he doesn't think about the consequences. He just thinks, oh, it's an easy way to appease them, get them off my back. Yeah, anybody who doesn't pray to me gets thrown into a den of lions. Yeah, sure, that'll happen. And then it happens to Daniel. And Darius goes and he says to Daniel, I'm sorry, I've got to do this. And Daniel says, that's okay. I did what was right, and I have faith that my God is going to protect me and keep me even though you put me in this den of ravenous lions. Which is exactly what happens. Daniel spends the night with the lions, and an angel of the Lord appears, and the text says that it shuts the mouth of the lions. Whether that's metaphorical or literal, whether there's an actual angel like wrestling with a lion all night, that's up to your imagination. There seems to be, in Darius's mind, some kind of either time limit or escape clause to all of this, because he comes running up to the lion's den the next day, and he sees that Daniel is alive. And so you would think that you would just kind of leave Daniel in there until the lions did finally get it together and eat him. But Darius is a compassionate person. He seems to be a bit kind of like a bumbling, foolish person. But he says, oh my gosh, Daniel, you're alive. Your God has saved you. I'm going to pull you out of the lion's den. I'm going to put away all those other wicked governors who conspired against you. You're going to be the third most important person in the entire Persian Empire. And then Darius delivers this almost kind of psalm of praise to the God of Israel. And there's almost a sense in which we're supposed to understand that Darius kind of converts to Judaism, which is a really interesting sort of tension, because like we've said, there's no historical evidence for the Persian Empire ever declaring Judaism as a state religion. But the kind of later on down the road, it's Cyrus, who would have been kind of in the line of this Darius, whoever he is, who allows the Jews to go back to Israel and Palestine. So maybe there's not an actual kind of official religious conversion, but maybe the experience of the sort of wise and faithful and patient Daniel and other Jews like him kind of softens the heart of the administration just enough to allow them to go back a couple of generations later. So Daniel continues to prosper until the reign of Cyrus the Persian, but the stories about Daniel the court tales about Daniel end after the lion's den. So we assume that as the third most important person in Babylon or in Persia, he just continues to kind of administer the government and be faithful and wise and do all of these good things. And when Cyrus becomes king, he sends all the exiles home, and the story picks up in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. So that's Daniel and the Babylonian exile. One last note for your edification before Dennis picks up with the prayer requests. Daniel has a lot of overlap with another biblical character that you might have drawn some connections to, who is wise and faithful in a foreign land and knows how to interpret dreams. Anybody? I hear some whispers. Yeah, Joseph. Joseph and Daniel have a lot of overlap. And the Joseph material is such a long and complex in terms of narrative story at the end of Genesis, which had, for the most part, been